What's up, guys? I've been helping people evaluate FedEx routes for over a decade, and I ran across a Facebook group that was talking about buying businesses, and someone was asking about what their thoughts were with FedEx routes. And I wanted to give some thoughts about both the questions that were posed by the poster, as well as some of the comments that we saw inside of that group. So we're going to go straight on down through some of these questions and posts, and we're going to get some of them clarified and answered a little bit better than maybe what's possible with just a real quick Facebook post. So here we go. So he says, what are your thoughts on these FedEx route businesses, and why are owners selling them? They seem to be producing good cash flow, and in some cases are semi-absentee based. Well, a couple of things. Why are people selling these routes? That's the best question to ask. And it's also one of the hardest questions to get answered, because there are a lot of very legitimate reasons why someone would be selling. Maybe they are moving. Maybe they are retiring. Maybe they're just bored of the business. They want to try something else or want to do their own thing, right? There's a million reasons why people could do it. The problem is when they give you a very legitimate sounding reason, which may have some elements of truth to it, it hides the real reason why they're selling. Because no one's going to say, well, I think this business is going to blow up in another 5 years. They're going to change the contract and it's not going to make any money anymore. And I'm going to be screwed. So I need to sell it right now before it's too late. Like, it'd be nice if they said that, but they don't, right? And I don't think that that's the case for the majority of the sellers. What we do have to figure out is why they are selling. There are ways to be able to try to figure that out as best we can. Nothing's foolproof, obviously, but trying to figure out why someone is selling is actually going to be one of the best reasons to look at this thing. And one of the other parts of his question is, they're producing good cash flow. That's often the case. And in some cases, they're semi-absentee based. Well, I like to make the joke that I can run any business in America completely absentee. I can also run it right into the ground, right? So just because a business is being run semi-absentee doesn't mean you're going to want to run it semi-absentee, because maybe he's running it into the ground. That happens a lot in these FedEx routes. And so we have to be very cautious and very aware of looking at two situations, of looking at a guy that's running things semi-absentee and he's running it into the ground, versus having very good operations that can allow the business to be run semi-absentee, right? So just because the owner is semi-absentee doesn't mean it's a good thing. You got to dig deeper and figure out how things are going beyond that with his contract, and there's a lot of other stuff. But for right now, just worry about trying to think about whether being semi-absentee and thinking about the risks levels that are associated with running any business absentee, for that matter, is going to be appropriate for you. So anyway, anyone have experience here with these businesses to provide feedback? There's going to be lots of people that have some experience and valuable feedback. And I think that that's valuable to see those things. You got to remember that a lot of times the people that post those things may have really positive experiences. For the most part, it's generally negative, because people that have gotten scammed, or they bought a bad business or whatever, they want to go online, they need to vent. I don't think that's the majority of people, in general, especially on groups like this. But you also have to remember, in other forums and other random places that you can find online, you're going to see that bias, and it's going to sound pretty bad because of that. The people that are enjoying their business, they're not going onto a forum and talking about, how bad or how great it is, right? They're out drinking margaritas, they're having a good time, they're traveling, they're doing whatever the hell that they want to do. So the point is you have to sort of remember that there's a little bit of a sample bias from asking random people. It's not that their opinions don't count. Obviously, some people have very bad experiences with that, and that does matter, and it does count. The problem is that you're seeing a very small section of all of the contractors out there in terms of this business, and it can kind of skew things a little negatively, and that's a little unfortunate, but it's also part of the reality of it. So anyway, I mentioned to the poster, it depends on who you are, whether this business is going to be appropriate. And the guy responds back, he says, okay, I'm looking at line haul business, which is also incredibly important. Are we looking at P&D, like home delivery and ground, pickup and delivery? Are we looking at line haul? Because those two businesses are extremely different. They attract different types of buyers with different risk profiles, different CapEx available, all sorts of stuff, right? So he's looking at line haul, which is great that he's got that narrowed down in terms of which model in the FedEx world that he is pursuing. And he's wondering, what is it about the right person? What traits should the right person have? And it's going to differ a little bit for all of these things, right? So for example, someone that has the trait of, I am happy to work on this business and I want to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week, that person is going to maybe be looking more for higher return, maybe a better ROI. They want higher cash flow. Okay, great. Well, we've got this one. This is the right business for you because it takes a bunch of time, but it makes a bunch of money. And this business over here, it doesn't take very much time, but it doesn't really make too much money either. And maybe now that's not an appropriate business for that person. So you have to realize that all FedEx routes are not created equal, that some are high risk, high reward, some are very low risk and low reward. Some are very stressful, some can be run semi-absentee, some are basically all hands on deck all the time. There's lots of different things that start to affect those things. Whether there's a manager in place obviously is a factor. It's not nearly the only factor. And there's a lot of other stuff that gets kind of weird, kind of off the books in terms of how much time it takes and those sorts of things. So it's important that that we don't just think like FedEx routes are only appropriate for this person or they're not appropriate for that person over there. In general, like you could say that, well, it's appropriate for someone that doesn't typically want to be 100% absentee, is content with making, under $600,000, $700,000 of net income, so that's going to eliminate a lot of private equity groups and a lot of large business flippers that I work with and that kind of deal. It also eliminates a lot of people that think that this is some magical business that you just buy it and the money flows in like it's a dividend stock or something like that. That's like, yes, that happens. But again, now we're back in terms of thinking about risk. Like you can run any business completely absentee, put a manager in place and see how long it lasts. Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 3 years. So it all depends. And each route is going to be different. And how much money you're putting into like management structures is going to determine how long that business is going to last before it blows up. There's a lot of little things there. And there's a lot of caveats that you have to look at to really be able to get a good idea of saying, these are the right traits and these are the wrong traits. Like, doesn't quite work like that. You still have to dig in because these routes and these businesses can be sort of molded to what you want a lot of times. Some of them can't. Some of them are very terminal manager dependent. Some of them are dependent upon the terminal itself or the structure of the routes. Are they rural? Are they urban? So there's lots of things that you can control. Some of the things you can't. The only way to be able to deal with it is to really start to dig in. So anyway, a couple of the other things here is that someone says that they thought it was a great idea too. They went to a couple of Facebook groups and they were shocked at how many people hate them. Yes, a lot of the people, this is what I was talking about earlier, a lot of people that are going to be in the forums, they're going to be hating on FedEx. The other thing is that a lot of times when you see these guys in forums, they might have owned routes for, let's say, 10 years, right? So imagine a guy that's owned 10 routes or owned routes for 10 years rather. And he has gone along and he's been absentee for 8 out of those 10 years. In the last 2 years, terminal management or whatever is sort of like cracked down. Oh, you need to do this. You need to do that. Oh, you need to come in for this meeting. You need to do all these things. And they say, gosh, this business is driving me crazy. I hate it. It's terrible. And then they go to the forum and they say, man, they're just bossing us around. We hate this thing. We can't wait to sell it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You didn't talk about the other 8 years where it was great. And by the way, if you had time for the business, because maybe they don't, maybe they've got another much better business or a business that they're passionate about or whatever. If they had time for it, it's a pretty good business. But for them, now it's terrible. Now they're going on the forums. Now they hate it. Now, is everyone that's on the forum that hates FedEx routes invalid or they're not telling the full story? No, there's some very legitimate reasons to hate this business. But the idea of thinking like, oh, it's just bad, I need to keep looking at something else or whatever. It's like thinking about like a crime scene cleanup is one of my favorite businesses to look at. Like someone's going to look at that business and say, hey, this is terrible. I got to like deal with a bunch of employees. They don't show up. Oh, I got to like clean up these crime scenes. They're disgusting. What have I done? This is a terrible business. But if you were just looking at the money, you might say, hey, this is a good business, right? So everything's a little bit unique to the person. And I would be cautious against sort of searching for ideas of whether it's good or bad or whatever, and just sort of think like, what are the most concrete, factual sorts of things that can't be like twisted or be vague, and then start to ask those sorts of questions and go from there. So one of the other posters mentions, hey, I've owned all these routes. Some are profitable. Most of them have dead bodies. It's a lot of work and it's not worth the time and the risk. Well, that's absolutely true for that person, right? It's not worth the time and the risk for him because maybe he's got a bunch of storage units. Maybe he's got a bunch of car washes or whatever. And the risk on those car washes is very low. The amount of time that's invested in that car wash is very low. And even though the money is a lot less than, FedEx route or whatever, apples to apples here, then, hey, it's not worth it. But for someone that doesn't mind jumping in a truck or doesn't mind managing a lot of people, doesn't mind sort of changing and adapting to new contractual structures and whatnot, they have the time for the business. Hey, now it's totally worth the time, right? Because the ROI is so much higher for them in these types of businesses. So the point is like when you see someone say it's not worth it, it's absolutely true that it's not worth it for them, but it might be worth it for you. And it might not be worth it for you, right? Depends on, again, what are you looking for? Are you looking to make $5 million and scale, to hundreds and hundreds of routes? Well, it's probably not for you. You looking to be 100% absentee? That's fine. But are you also okay with ruining your business and having it blow up in 5 years, right? Like, hopefully not. And so you say, oh, okay, you got to dig into it and you have to start looking at it. And then that will start to help. The poster also mentions that people are selling because they're not as profitable as they were 5 years ago. I mean, there can be some truth to that. It depends on the types of routes. So for example, one of the big things that was in the media was like, gas prices have gone up. And so FedEx contractors are not doing as well. Maybe there's some truth to that. In fact, I know that there's some truth to that for certain types of routes. So for example, the way that a route engineer or route architect decides to pay for these things, up at FedEx, it's going to be different for every single contract. And so a rural batch of routes is going to be paid differently than an urban batch of routes. So obviously the ones that are urban, where they're only doing 20 miles, round trip, they're going to be impacted less from gas. Like they don't really care. It's a smaller amount of their total expenses or whatever than the guy that's in rural West Virginia that does 300 miles a day round trip for every one of his routes, right? So there are bits of truth to these things. Like, yes, some people are absolutely getting out because it's not profitable for them, and they are the ones that are selling. There are other people that are just burnt out. They've done it for years. They're tired of it. They're moving. They're ready to retire. They're ready to just do anything else besides look at another cardboard box or another truck that could break down, right? I get it. But we've got to be able to figure out which seller is which. Oh, this guy wants to get out because he thought it was absentee and he realizes it's not really. Or this guy wants to get out because he thought he could scale to $1 million a year, but he's stuck at 500K, or whatever. And when you can start to figure out what those real answers are, you start to get some really juicy tidbits in terms of being able to evaluate that business correctly. So anyway, one of the other things, someone was saying that you need to dig into the condition of the trucks, and the depreciation of these is a real expense. Yeah, it's a real expense. And a lot of the times when we see these things sold by brokers, we don't really see any sort of mention of depreciation. We don't see any mention of fleet replacement. These things, though, despite that, and there are reasons why they don't show that. It's not like they forgot. Like the route brokers that have been doing this have been doing it for several years. Most of them. Some are fly-by-night brokers. They come and they go, and that's fine. But for the people that have been around for several years, it's not like they just forgot to mention depreciation or any of these sorts of expenses. Those expenses are real, obviously, in terms of your maintenance, in terms of vehicle replacement and that sort of deal. But that doesn't really talk about whether this is a business that is appropriate for someone or not appropriate, or why people are selling, and that kind of thing. Obviously, fleet management and fleet evaluation is a big component of things, but I wouldn't let like any business that's got a lot of depreciating assets or whatever, I wouldn't let that get in my way. Like real estate's kind of awesome, right? It depreciates a lot too, so you can appreciate that. So there are bits of truth again to this statement here, but you also want to consider whether, hey, wait a minute, even though that sounds bad, there's a lot of expenses here. Does that mean that the business is bad? Maybe not. So anyway, someone else says it's a consolidation play. Lots of other owner-operators and trucking companies are buying them. Again, bits of truth to that. The other thing is that for the most part, we do see limitations on how large these businesses can get. There are terminal scale rules, meaning that you can only own so much of the incoming and outgoing package volume under a single terminal, under a single corporation. There are little rules like this. They get circumvented. There are ways to that a lot of these contractors can sort of like exploit loopholes for better or for worse, probably more for worse than for better. But yeah, you can see that happen. But that, again, that's talking about what's happening once the routes are already on the market. Well, wait a minute. Why are they on the market to begin with? Why are they actually selling? If one big company wants to buy them all up, that's fine. But we needed to know why they were selling to begin with. That, focusing back on that, I think, is a really good idea. Anyway, finally, the last comment here that I want to mention, he says, I put an inquiry on one. Haven't heard much back, still waiting. This happens. And a lot of times people will come to me and they'll say, Tony, I've been looking, I've been inquiring about these businesses. I haven't heard anything back. Am I saying something wrong? No. A lot of the brokers, not all of them, a lot of them just won't get back to you. They're like too busy. They're calling in sick. They start to get something under contract and they think that they don't need to follow up and be respectful of people's time to say, hey, this thing's already under contract. I'll let you know if something else pops up or whatever. It's just the way it is. There's no like real regulation or whatever, or standards in terms of what it takes to become a route broker. Again, a lot of the route brokers are great. I know several of them personally, good people. Are all of them that way? Absolutely not. And this is an extremely common thing. And so a lot of times it's just a matter of like finding the route and then also making sure that the broker will actually respond back and give you the information. So anyway, a lot of stuff here. Wanted to unpack just a couple of these comments, which are all very good. It's just important to try to keep unpacking these comments and questions to where you can start to make sense of it and try to avoid the vagaries that happen from a Facebook post. Because even I've tried to respond back here. Like, it's difficult, right? It's difficult for everyone. That's why I'm making this YouTube post. I'm sure I could go into much more depth on all these topics. But anyway, I hope this helps at least a little bit clarify sort of your journey in terms of looking at these routes. And I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.